Hello and welcome. The operation is continuing at full throttle. There is still no ceasefire on the table. Those are the words of an Israeli defence source to the BBC as the conflict in Israel and Gaza continues. 2 Palestinian militants have been killed in the latest Israeli air raids targeting Gaza City overnight. Palestinian rockets were launched at southern Israel. Let's show you the latest figures from the health ministry in Gaza that says that 219 people have been killed, including 63 children, while 12 people have been killed in Israel, including 2 children. A spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General said about 50,000 Palestinians in Gaza had been displaced so far. And in the last hour, we've been hearing from the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He has defended Israel's military actions.
We try to target those who target us with great precision. That is not as surgical an operation as it is. Even in a surgical room in a hospital, you don't have the ability to prevent collateral damage around the affected tissues. Even then you can't. And certainly in a military operation you cannot. But there is no army in the world that does more than the Israeli army, in the Israeli security services, in Israeli intelligence, to prevent collateral damage. To have Israel criticized for that is absurd.
Benjamin Netanyahu speaking just a short time ago. In a moment, we'll speak to a former UN human rights official. First, though, Mark Lebel reports on events on the ground overnight.
More Israeli airstrikes, more militants killed in Gaza for a 10th day. A Palestinian rocket intercepted by Israel's air defences. After an earlier strike in southern Israel killed 2 foreign farm workers. So continues a cycle of violence. Visiting an airbase in southern Israel, its prime minister appears relaxed, saying Hamas has been set back by many years.
We will continue as necessary to restore peace to all Israeli citizens.
But things are not getting more peaceful. Last seen 16 years ago, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, armed Palestinians, rear their heads in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. In Jericho, Arab protesters are met with rubber-coated steel bullets and tear gas. Also feeling the heat from all this is America, who, despite voicing its support for a ceasefire, has so far blocked United Nations-backed efforts to end hostilities.
Where should the poor go? Where should the weak go? Isn't the UN the house of all people?
France now wants the UN's powerful Security Council, which includes America, to vote for a ceasefire and greater humanitarian access in Gaza. But
the U.S. view has for many years been that the Security Council is not the place to resolve issues between non-state actors like Hamas and Israel. I think the U.S. is going to veto it, but it will be part of this growing sense that the U.S. will support that we have to begin winding this up, I think, within days.
With all eyes on Gaza, whichever way the US proceeds its push for peace here, unilaterally or inside the UN, it's now under sustained political pressure, both at home and abroad, to do so fast. Mark Lobel, BBC News.
Well, let's talk more about what the world is doing to find a peaceful solution to this. We can speak to John Dugard, former UN Special Rapporteur to the UNHCR. John, good to see you. Israeli Defence Forces and sources have just told us that the bombardment will continue. There is no ceasefire. What do you believe it would take to bring Israel to the table to look at and agree to a ceasefire?
Well, there are certain difficulties in the way of a ceasefire. First of all, there's the problem that the United States is blocking any resolution from the Security Council, which is the obvious body to initiate such action. But there's also the problem of the refusal of Israel and the United States and other countries to speak to Hamas directly. So you have the bizarre situation that so-called or prospective mediators are unwilling to speak to both sides in the conflict, and that's a problem for the ceasefire.
So do you believe, John, that the US is not actually an honest broker now in this?
I think it's become very clear that the US is not an honest broker. First of all, there's the evidence provided by the failure of the United States to support a resolution at this stage. But secondly, there's the fact that the United States continues to operate its embassy from Jerusalem, which is contrary to international law. And also there's the fact that the United States pays military aid or tribute to Israel in the form of $3.8 billion a year. So the United States has disqualified itself as an honest broker. And that means that the Security Council will now have to initiate any peace process that arises from the present conflict.
So do you believe the reality is that the US, that President Biden is just going to allow Israel this window now to achieve its objectives?
The evidence seems to suggest that. And I think it's time that the United States refuted some of the allegations made by Prime Minister Netanyahu. For instance, his recent statement that the Israeli Defense Forces do not target civilian targets is simply disproved by the evidence. The Israeli Defense Forces have repeatedly targeted areas where they know that there will be collateral damage which will injure civilians. So I think the United States is obliged to address issues of this kind and also to withdraw its statement that Israel is entitled to act in self-defense. This is not a conflict between states. Israel is engaged in a police operation in Gaza, and it is subject to the rules of proportionality. So I think on all counts, Israel must now be seen to be in violation of international law. But to make matters worse, the United States is aiding and abetting the government of Israel in these activities.
John, who is talking to Hamas?
Egypt appears to be...
We know that for sure, that they are.
Yes. And in previous conflicts of this kind in 2008, 2009, and 2014, it was principally Egypt that brought about the ceasefire. Though in 2014, John Kerry did play an important role in brokering a ceasefire, but that doesn't seem to be the policy of the Biden administration.
How do you think, John, the Abraham Accords are complicating things? I mean, Arab countries had originally said they hoped this would give them some leverage over Israel. That is clearly not the case. In fact, it's turned out to actually be quite embarrassing for them.
Yes, the states that are party to the Abraham Accords have not played a role in this at all. It seems that Egypt is determined to assert itself as the broker between Hamas, Palestine, and Israel. And I think it's most likely to achieve its goal, of course, together with Jordan. So I think the Abraham Accord states have been completely marginalized.
John Dugard, good to get your thoughts. Thanks for joining us from The Hague. We're going to take you live now to pictures where we're getting in from the West Bank town of Berlin. We can see here a Palestinian funeral taking place. Crowds have gathered there, and we know that from the health ministry, 219 people have been killed, including 63 children. So many funerals taking place. And these are live pictures that we're seeing right now as people gather in the West Bank.